When I saw the way he handed me the garden gloves that morning, so neatly folded, so carefully placed on the edge of the porch, it wasn't the gesture itself that made my stomach tighten. It was the fact that he didn't ring the bell, didn't knock, didn't even wait. Just left them there like a whisper I wasn't supposed to hear. I stood behind the curtain, unseen, watching him walk away without looking back, and I felt the weight of something shift inside me. It was small, maybe meaningless to someone else, but to me, it was the beginning. The moment something started cracking. I wish I could say I didn't know what would follow. I wish I could tell you I was confused. But I wasn't. I knew. I knew from the way his eyes had lingered on mine the day before, from the way my skin remembered the echo of his touch long after he was gone. I knew from the way I woke up this morning hoping, not fearing, that he would show up again. That was 3 months ago. And now, sitting here, staring at the same gloves folded on my lap, I realize everything changed that day. Not all at once. Slowly. Quietly. But let me take you back to the start. Before the kiss. Before the mistake. Before the abandoned house and the look on my husband's face that shattered the air between us. Before I stopped being just a wife and started becoming someone else. But first, tell me in the comments, what's the one thing you've hidden that you swore no one would ever find out? And if they did, what would it cost you? It started with silence. Not the kind that screams or echoes. The kind that stretches between two people like fog between hills, is thick, damp, barely noticeable at first. But always there. He was never cruel. Never distant in the way stories often paint men who forget their wives. He remembered anniversaries. He brought groceries. He even asked how I slept. But somewhere along the way, I had become a piece of furniture in our shared life, reliable, polished, rarely touched. We moved into the new house in early spring. A large 2-story with a tired garden and cracked stone steps. A house that looked like it had known better years. My husband said it had good bones. I wondered if he meant us too. The first week was a blur of boxes, lists, misplaced items, and strained smiles. I tried to find joy in the small things, a drawer that closed properly, the way the morning sun hit the kitchen sink, the smell of fresh earth in the garden. But the emptiness inside me felt louder in the stillness of this new place. Our old apartment had been noisy. Closer to life. Here, the silence was sharper. On the 4th day, he brought him. "This is the guy I told you about," my husband said, motioning toward the man standing at the door with dusty jeans and a quiet smile. "He'll help with the yard. He's been working with me a few years now. Reliable." The man nodded. "Nice to meet you." His voice was even, almost soft, but his eyes held something else, something that felt like awareness. As if he saw more than he was supposed to. I smiled politely, said thank you, and turned away too quickly. He started coming in the mornings. At first, he just worked. No conversation beyond the practical, where the tools were, what needed trimming. But then came the comments, subtle, careful. "You seem to like roses," he said one day. "They'll do better in that corner. More morning light." I hadn't told him that. Hadn't told anyone that. And yet he'd noticed. My husband, on the other hand, had stopped noticing things a long time ago. One afternoon, I stood at the kitchen window and watched them speak by the hedge. The sun lit my husband's shoulders, and he gestured with his hands the way he always did when explaining something technical. The other man stood still, listening, nodding occasionally. I couldn't hear the words, but I felt the distance between them. And then he turned slightly, just enough to glance at the window, and for a brief second our eyes met. I looked away. That night, my husband was home late. Again. He left a note on the counter about a supplier issue. I read it twice, not because it said anything new, but because I wasn't sure why it made me feel so tired. I went to bed alone, the air around me colder than usual. In the morning, the man was back. He was clearing weeds near the back gate. I brought him a bottle of water, unsure why. He thanked me with a slight smile and said, "You don't have to." "I know," I replied, and walked away. The gloves came next. One morning, I stepped outside to find a pair of gardening gloves on the porch. They were new, stiff, and used, still smelling faintly of plastic. A small tag was tucked inside, for the roses. My name wasn't written, but the handwriting on the tag wasn't my husband's. He never wrote in cursive. I didn't ask. Neither did he. And that silence said more than words ever could. Later that week, I saw my husband and the man talking near the garage. Laughing. Like old friends. My husband clapped him on the back and said something I couldn't hear, and I felt the sting of something bitter rise in my chest. Not jealousy. Not yet. Something else. Something that made me walk inside and grip the edge of the sink until my knuckles ached. In the evenings, I started walking the garden alone. Watching how the plants leaned toward the setting sun, how the wind moved the leaves in slow waves. It felt like something waiting. Like the moment before a breath. One day, I found him there. He was fixing the trellis by the back fence. I didn't expect him. He didn't expect me either. "I thought you'd be out," he said, wiping his hands. I lied. "I came back early." He nodded. "You like the garden?" I paused. "I think I'm learning to." He tilted his head, studying me, not in the way men usually do, but with something close to curiosity. "It suits you." I should have walked away. I didn't. The next morning, my husband left before sunrise. "A business trip," he said. "Just 2 nights." He kissed my cheek, told me not to wait up. I watched his car disappear around the corner, then turned back to the house. And it was too quiet. By the afternoon, the silence became unbearable. I opened the box of gloves and put them on. Walked to the roses. Started pruning. When he arrived, I didn't pretend surprise. He looked at me, just looked, and that was enough. That night, as I lay in bed, I thought of all the moments that led us here. And I knew, deep down, this was only the beginning. The next morning was warmer than usual. The kind of morning where the sun feels closer, more intrusive, like it's not just lighting the room but examining it. I stood in the kitchen, barefoot on the cold tiles, staring at the empty coffee pot. My husband hadn't called since he left. That wasn't unusual. He often slipped into work like water into cracks, quiet, methodical, disappearing without making a sound. I opened the window and let the air in. It smelled like soil and cut grass, mixed with something faintly metallic. The scent of routine. But routine had started to feel foreign lately, like a coat that no longer fit right. He arrived just before noon, his truck pulling up in its usual quiet hum. I watched him through the blinds again, a habit I hadn't realized I'd formed. He got out, adjusted his cap, and walked around to the back without knocking. It wasn't arrogance. It was familiarity. And that's what scared me most. I waited 15 minutes before stepping outside. He was kneeling by the rosebed, trowel in hand, dirt streaking his forearm. I saw the gloves I'd worn yesterday placed neatly on a wooden bench. Cleaned. Dried. It hit me unexpectedly, that simple act. A small intimacy disguised as a favor. Something my husband hadn't done in years. Maybe never. He looked up when he heard my steps. There was no smile, no greeting. Just a glance, a shared moment of acknowledgement that passed between us like a low current. Neither of us spoke. I stood beside him, watching his hands move through the soil with practiced calm. He didn't ask why I was there. He didn't need to. We worked in silence for nearly an hour. I trimmed leaves. He set new stakes. Every so often, our hands would brush, and I'd feel the air change. Dense. Still. Electric. It wasn't just attraction. It was recognition. The kind you feel when someone sees the version of you you've hidden from the world. At one point, I leaned down to tie my shoelace, and as I rose, I caught him looking. Not in a way that made me flinch. In a way that made my breath catch. I didn't look away. Eventually, we broke for water. I poured 2 glasses in the kitchen, my hands slightly trembling, and brought them outside. He took his without a word. We sat under the shade of the back awning, the wooden bench creaking softly beneath us. "I cleaned your gloves," he said quietly, finally breaking the silence. I nodded. I noticed. A pause. "You don't talk much," I added. He shrugged. "Most people don't really want the truth when they ask questions. I prefer silence." There was something disarming about that. Something painfully honest. I wondered when was the last time I'd had a conversation that wasn't built on convenience or politeness. "Do you always notice things other people miss?" I asked. He looked at me for a long second before answering. "Only when they're worth noticing." I didn't respond. My throat tightened, and I felt my cheeks flush, not from embarrassment, but from the weight of being seen. That afternoon, he asked if I wanted to come see a project he was finishing nearby. A garden he'd been working on for weeks. I hesitated. My instinct said no, but instinct had grown unreliable lately. So I said yes. We drove in silence. The kind that doesn't press on your ears but fills the space like music you've forgotten the name of. The streets passed slowly, shaded by tall trees, and I found myself watching the way his hands moved on the steering wheel, steady, grounded, controlled. The house was modest, tucked away behind a row of overgrown hedges. But the garden was alive. Wild in a curated way. Flowers bloomed in odd, beautiful combinations, and stone paths curved like rivers through patches of herbs and ornamental grasses. I walked slowly, letting my fingers brush the tops of lavender and mint, my mind quiet for the first time in days. "You made this?" I asked, turning to him. He nodded. "It helps me think." We stood there for a while, side by side, not touching, not talking. Just breathing. On the way back, he took a different route. Scenic, longer. I didn't ask why. The road curved along the edge of a small lake, and he pulled over without warning. We stepped out. The air was cooler there, touched with water and pine. We walked to the dock, the wood beneath our feet worn and silvered with age. He stood at the edge, hands in his pockets. I joined him. "Why did you bring me here?" I asked. He didn't answer right away. "Because I knew you needed to be somewhere no one else would expect you to be." The honesty of it stunned me. Not because it was bold, but because it was accurate. I turned to face him. He was looking at the water. "I feel like I've been sleepwalking," I said softly. "For years." He finally met my gaze. "Maybe this is you waking up." And then it happened. We kissed. Nothing more. Nothing less. It wasn't planned. It wasn't dramatic. It just happened. Quietly. Completely. And I let it. When we pulled apart, I didn't say anything. Neither did he. We stood there, the lake still beside us, the sun leaning low in the sky. I felt the weight of my choices settle into my bones. the drive home was even quieter. He dropped me off at the end of the street. Didn't ask to walk me back. I was grateful for that. I needed the space. The silence. Inside the house, the walls felt different. Closer. More aware. I went upstairs, peeled off my clothes, and stood under the shower until the hot water turned cold. Lying in bed that night, I didn't cry. I didn't overthink. I simply stared at the ceiling, wondering if this was the moment everything began to shift, or if it was already too late to pretend it hadn't. Either way, I knew something irreversible had just occurred. And I wasn't ready for the consequences. But they were coming. I could feel them, like rain waiting just beyond the clouds. The next morning I woke up before the sun did, the sky still faintly blue with that early softness that only lasts a few minutes before the day takes over. I sat at the edge of the bed, feeling the weight of the air around me. My hands rested on my knees, and for a long while I just breathed. The kiss had happened. It wasn't a dream or something I could fold away into denial. It was real, and it had a presence, like an object I now had to carry. My husband hadn't called. Again. I stared at my phone, willing it to light up with his name, to give me something that could pull me back to the version of myself I used to know. But it remained dark. Silent. I moved through the morning like a shadow. Made the bed, opened windows, let light in. But the light only made me feel more exposed. I looked around at the house, neat, filled with tasteful furniture, soft linens, and quiet colors. It had everything we were told made a home. Except the feeling of someone being truly present in it. Around 10, I went out to the garden. The air was already warm. The roses were growing unevenly, and some of the petals were beginning to brown at the edges. I knelt beside them, inspecting the roots, not because I cared about their health at that moment, but because I needed to do something with my hands. I heard the gate open behind me. The sound was so familiar now that it barely startled me. I didn't turn around. He didn't say anything. He just walked past and set his tools down near the bench. For a while, we worked like that, apart, together. Eventually, I sat back and looked over at him. He was adjusting the trellis, fingers wrapping around the wood as if it were something fragile. His presence no longer felt foreign. It was almost dangerous, how normal it felt now. "You don't have to come today," I said, breaking the silence. He looked over at me. "I know." That was all. He didn't leave. I didn't ask him to. After lunch, I went inside to sort some things in the laundry room. I pulled down a box from the shelf, one of those that never got unpacked after the move. Inside were winter scarves, old letters, and an envelope with my handwriting on it. I didn't remember writing it. It was addressed to him, my husband. I opened it. Inside, a short note I must have written months ago. "I miss how you used to look at me when I wasn't watching." The ink had smudged a little. I sat down on the floor, holding it in my lap. I didn't cry. I just stared at the words, trying to remember who I was when I wrote them. That afternoon, my husband called. His name lit up the screen like a sudden flare. I answered quickly, clearing my throat. "Hey," he said. "Just checking in. How's everything?" I told him it was fine. The garden was coming along. I didn't mention the man working just outside the window. He said he might be back a day later than planned. Something about a delay with materials. I told him to take his time. He thanked me for being patient. I hung up and stood still for a long while, the quiet settling back around me. Later, I sat on the back porch with a cup of tea. He was still out there, watering the far corner. The sky was turning amber, and the first hints of evening crept in. He came up the steps and stood near the railing, not too close. "I might not come tomorrow," he said. "Okay," I replied, not asking why. He stayed a few seconds longer before turning and walking away. That night, I dreamt I was running through our old apartment, hallways too narrow, rooms unfamiliar. Every door I opened revealed a garden, but each one had something missing. A tree with no roots. A bench with no legs. A man with no face. I woke up sweating, heart pounding in my chest like a warning. I didn't see him the next day. Instead, I filled the hours with errands. Groceries. A stop at the pharmacy. Gas. Everything felt slightly out of focus, like I was watching myself perform a script I had long since stopped caring about. In the late afternoon, I saw the neighbor across the street, an older woman with silver hair and a sharp gaze. She waved. I waved back. Then she called out, "He's good with the plants. But I think he likes being here more than he admits." I blinked at her. "Who?" She smiled slightly. "The one who's always fixing things." I forced a polite nod and went back inside. But her words stayed with me, like a splinter under the skin. That evening, I stood in front of my closet for too long. I wasn't dressing for anyone. I told myself that. But I chose a blouse I hadn't worn in years, one with a neckline that made me feel just a little less invisible. I wore it to water the plants. I stayed out until the sky turned navy and the first stars appeared. Then I sat on the porch steps, watching the lights flicker on across the neighborhood. The world felt so ordinary, and yet everything inside me had shifted. The next day, he came back. I was already in the garden when he arrived. We didn't speak for a long time. He worked silently beside me, and I didn't ask where he'd been. But something in his face had changed. He looked tired, like someone who had made a decision they couldn't take back. After we finished for the day, I walked him to the gate. He paused before leaving, eyes scanning the porch, the windows, the edges of everything. "I meant to stay away," he said quietly. "I know," I replied. "But I couldn't." He didn't say anything else. He just left. And I stood there, staring at the closed gate, knowing that nothing we said or didn't say would change what was happening. It was unfolding now, piece by piece, with or without our permission. That night, I opened my old journal. The pages were filled with neat handwriting, to-do lists, and shopping notes. But on one of the last pages, I found something I had forgotten. Sometimes, silence is not the absence of words. It's the presence of everything left unsaid. I closed the book, placed it back on the shelf, and turned off the light. Because now, the silence was louder than ever. There was something strange about the way time moved that week. It didn't rush or crawl, it drifted. Days bled into each other like colors in water, and I found myself checking the calendar not because I needed to remember anything, but because I needed proof the world was still moving forward. My husband still hadn't returned. Another delay. Another vague update in a short message. I responded with something equally short, then placed my phone face down. The garden had become a place of both comfort and quiet unrest. I spent more time there than anywhere else. Trimming, watering, rearranging. It wasn't about the plants anymore. It was about movement. About distraction. About keeping my hands busy when my mind refused to settle. He hadn't come in 2 days. I told myself that was good. That it gave me time to think, to reflect, to regain control over whatever was spiraling inside me. But each time I walked past the gate and saw it untouched, I felt a pang. Not disappointment exactly. Not longing either. Just something unnameable, like an echo of a thought I couldn't catch. On the third morning, I woke up earlier than usual. The house was still cloaked in that pre-dawn grayness, where nothing has a defined edge. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, staring out at the yard. I didn't expect him to return. Maybe he had made the right choice. Maybe he had done what I hadn't found the courage to do, step back before the damage became permanent. Around 9, I heard the creak of the gate. It was the sound of something familiar returning, something I wasn't sure I deserved to feel relief over. I didn't go out right away. I watched through the window as he walked to the shed, retrieved his tools, and began to work near the hydrangeas. His movements were slow, precise, and quieter than usual. As if he was unsure whether he was welcome. When I finally stepped outside, he didn't look up. For a while, I didn't say anything. I watered the plants near the fence, keeping a few yards between us. The air was heavier that day, thick with the scent of damp soil and warming leaves. I could hear the distant hum of a neighbor's lawnmower, a dog barking somewhere down the street. Everything else was still. Eventually, he straightened up, brushing dirt from his hands. He looked over at me. "I shouldn't have come," he said. I shook my head. "But you did." He hesitated before walking over, keeping just enough distance between us to not be a threat. We stood there, facing each other, with a kind of restrained honesty I hadn't felt in years. "I tried to stay away," he said. "I thought it would be easier." Was it? No. Neither of us smiled. There was no lightness in the moment. Only truth. Raw and quiet. "I don't know what I'm doing anymore," I admitted, the words slipping out before I could stop them. He didn't offer advice or comfort. Just nodded, as if to say, "Same." We returned to our work without another word. Later that day, I found an unopened box tucked behind a stack of folded blankets in the hallway closet. It had my name on it in my husband's handwriting. Inside, a photo frame, 2 candles, and a handwritten note on stiff paper. "For the new porch," it said. "So it feels like yours." I sat down on the floor and read it again. Then again. It wasn't just a gift. It was a gesture of consideration. A small, quiet love. One I had overlooked. I left the box untouched for the rest of the day. That evening, I stayed out longer than usual. The sky was stained with streaks of orange and pink, and the wind was light, just enough to move the chimes by the back door. I sat on the steps with a blanket around my shoulders, not waiting for anyone, but not entirely alone in my thoughts either. The sound of footsteps startled me. I turned to see him walking up the path, slower than usual. He stopped a few feet away. "I know I said I wouldn't come back again," he said. I nodded. "But here you are." "I needed to say something," he continued. "And I needed to say it when it wasn't part of the work, or the routine, or the moments in between." I looked at him carefully. There was no urgency in his face, no pressure. Just someone trying to carry something heavy and needing to set it down. "I've worked with a lot of people," he said. "Been in a lot of backyards. Met a lot of wives. Most of them looked through me. You didn't. That doesn't mean I should have. I know. I'm not saying it justifies anything. I just wanted you to know that it meant something. That you meant something." I swallowed hard. My hands were cold despite the blanket. "I don't know how to fix this," I whispered. "Maybe it's not about fixing," he said. "Maybe it's about not running from what we already broke." He didn't wait for an answer. He just nodded once and walked back down the path, leaving the air full of unspoken things. Inside, I sat at the kitchen table again, staring at the box my husband had packed for me. I opened it once more, lit the candles, and placed them on the porch like he had intended. The frame remained inside. I didn't feel ready to fill it with anything yet. That night, I lay awake for hours, listening to the wind brush against the windows, the occasional creak of the house settling. My mind moved in circles. Not guilt exactly. Not regret either. Just that same strange ache I couldn't name. Like remembering something important too late. I wasn't in love with the man from the garden. Not in the way stories define it. It was something else. A mirror held up to the parts of me I hadn't faced in a long time. The lonely parts. The quiet desperation for tenderness. The need to be seen. In the morning, I found another note from my husband. He had sent it during the night. Got the flights changed. I'll be back Friday evening. Miss you. I read it 3 times. Then I stood in front of the mirror and looked at myself in full daylight. My reflection didn't look guilty. It looked tired. Worn down by pretending things were okay for so long. By silence. By avoidance. And now, with Friday approaching, I had to decide what to do with the truth I carried. Because it wasn't just about the kiss. It was about everything that had been broken long before it happened. And now I had to face the pieces, one by one. The day started with rain. Not the kind that arrives with thunder and drama, but the slow, steady kind that makes everything smell like soil and stillness. It tapped lightly against the windows, weaving itself into the quiet of the house. I watched it from the kitchen, my hands wrapped around a warm mug, unsure whether I was waiting for something or trying to delay the inevitable. Friday was 2 days away. The message from my husband replayed in my mind on a loop. Back Friday evening. Miss you. It was kind, considerate, almost sweet. The kind of message that once would have made me smile. Now it just sat heavy in my chest, like a stone that wouldn't move. I stayed indoors for most of the morning. There wasn't much to do. The house was clean. The laundry was folded. The garden would have to wait. I wandered from room to room, rearranging objects I had no reason to touch. A vase turned slightly to the left. A picture frame straightened. Curtains pulled back, then closed again. Around noon, the rain stopped. I stepped out onto the porch, the air thick with the smell of wet wood and distant grass. The ground glistened, puddles gathering at the base of the steps. I didn't expect him to come that day. After everything we'd said, after everything unsaid, I assumed we had both drawn an invisible line. But just before 2 o'clock, I heard the soft squeak of the gate opening. I didn't move. I just stood there, one hand resting on the railing, as he walked slowly up the path. His clothes were damp around the hem, his hair pushed back, slightly darker from the weather. He didn't smile. Neither did I. He stopped at the bottom of the steps, his eyes scanning my face like he was searching for permission to speak. I didn't think you'd come, I said finally. I wasn't sure either, he replied. There was a pause, not awkward but necessary. The kind of pause that gives weight to what comes next. I finished the last row of stone by the fence, he said, like it mattered. I nodded. Thank you. He didn't come up the steps. He stayed right where he was, water dripping from his jacket, his fingers twitching slightly as if unsure what to do with the stillness between us. Do you want to see it? He asked after a moment. I hesitated. Then I nodded again. We walked to the back of the garden together, not touching, not speaking. The rain had softened the earth, and the stone path he had laid looked cleaner, newer, like it belonged there. It curved gently along the edge of the roses, framing them in a way I hadn't imagined but immediately appreciated. It's beautiful, I said, and I meant it. He crouched down, adjusting one of the smaller stones, brushing away a leaf. I wanted it to look like it had always been here, he murmured. We stood there in silence, the dampness of the ground seeping into the soles of my shoes. There was nothing romantic about the moment. No grand confession. No lingering glances. Just two people standing in a space they had both changed in quiet, irreversible ways. "I don't know what happens next," I said quietly. "Neither do I." He stood up, wiping his hands on the back of his jeans. His eyes didn't hold expectation, only honesty. The kind that doesn't demand anything in return. "I have to leave soon," he added. "New job. Other side of town." Something in me tightened, though I had no right to feel anything at all. I nodded, not trusting my voice. He took a step closer. Just one. Close enough that I could feel the warmth of his presence, but far enough to not cross that invisible line again. "I didn't plan for any of this," he said. "But I won't pretend it didn't matter." I met his gaze. It mattered. And then, before I could think too much, before I could stop myself, I stepped forward. Our eyes held for the briefest moment, and then we kissed. It was soft. Still. Nothing urgent or wild. Just two people closing a chapter they never meant to write. When it ended, neither of us said anything. He stepped back. I did too. The rain began again, gently at first, just enough to feel on the skin. He turned and walked away, his footsteps steady, purposeful. I watched until he disappeared around the side of the house, the sound of the gate closing marking the end of something I couldn't name. I stayed out in the garden for a long time after that. The roses glistened with water. The stone path curved gently through the green, a silent trace of what had been. I walked it slowly, my fingers trailing along the petals, the coolness of the rain soaking through the fabric of my shirt. I didn't go inside until the sky began to darken. That evening, I opened a drawer in my bedroom and took out the journal I had avoided for weeks. I wrote a single line across the first blank page. Some mistakes come quietly, without warning, but once they arrive, they never leave the room. I closed the journal and slid it back into the drawer. Tomorrow I would prepare the house. Clean the kitchen again. Change the sheets. Set the candles on the porch where my husband could see them. Act as if everything was normal. As if nothing had changed. As if the space between what was and what is could be swept away with enough effort. But tonight, I sat by the window and listened to the rain. Letting it fall. Letting it take whatever it needed. Letting it wash over the quiet part of me that still didn't know what kind of woman I had become, or if there was still time to decide. The morning he was due back arrived with an unsettling calm. The skies were clear, unusually so, as if the weather itself had taken a breath and was holding it. The house felt too quiet, though nothing was out of place. Every object remained exactly where it belonged. And yet I felt like I was walking through someone else's life, a version of it that looked identical on the outside but was hollowed out inside. I stood in front of the mirror longer than usual, adjusting the collar of my shirt, brushing invisible lint from the sleeves. I wasn't trying to impress. I wasn't trying to hide. I was trying to find the woman who used to live in this skin, before the kiss, before the silence, before the choices that folded over each other like layers of fabric, suffocating and soft all at once. I moved through the day like I was rehearsing something. I cleaned the kitchen counters even though they were already spotless. I rearranged the cushions on the living room couch, then undid the arrangement. I lit the candles he'd left in the box, placing them on the porch just as he had imagined, unsure if I was honoring a memory or trying to overwrite it. Around noon, I sat in the garden. The bench by the roses was warm from the sun. The soil still held the scent of yesterday's rain. The path was as he left it, curved, deliberate, quiet. I didn't walk it. I just watched it from a distance. It was hard to believe only days had passed since everything shifted. Harder still to believe I had carried all this inside me without breaking open. And yet I had. And now the question wasn't what I'd done. It was what I was going to do next. By late afternoon, I started preparing dinner. Nothing elaborate. Just enough to feel like I had tried. I wasn't sure why I was trying. Perhaps habit. Perhaps guilt. Perhaps the aching hope that a normal evening would give me the illusion of peace. I marinated the chicken, chopped vegetables with slow precision, wiped my hands on the towel even when they weren't wet. At 5:48, I heard the familiar hum of tires on gravel. My breath caught. I turned off the stove and moved to the window. The car door opened. He stepped out, suitcase in hand, shoulders slightly slouched from the drive. He looked older than I remembered. Or maybe I had just never really looked at him before. I didn't rush to greet him. I stood there, hidden behind the frame of the window, waiting for my heart to settle. When he reached the porch, he paused. I wondered if he noticed the candles. I wondered if he thought about the note he'd written, about what this house meant now that it held pieces he hadn't placed there. I opened the door before he could knock. He smiled. Not wide, not forced. Just enough to say, "I'm home." "Hi," I said, stepping aside. He entered the house with the ease of routine. Dropped his bag by the stairs. Looked around, taking in the air, the light, the unchanged furniture. I watched him take it all in as if he were trying to memorize something. "Smells good," he said, nodding toward the kitchen. "Dinner's almost ready." We moved around each other like two dancers who'd forgotten the steps but still remembered the rhythm. He changed his clothes. I set the table. Neither of us spoke about anything that mattered. Not yet. At dinner, the conversation stayed on the surface. Work, traffic, the weather. He asked about the garden. I said it was coming along. He mentioned expanding the patio. I nodded. It felt like filling a cup with water when it was already cracked. The effort mattered. But the leak was still there. After we finished eating, he stood and stretched. "I'm going to unpack," he said. I started clearing the table. The sound of utensils against plates filled the silence. I moved slowly, rinsing each dish like it required deep attention. When I was done, I walked outside, kneading the air. The garden glowed in the soft light of early evening. The candles flickered faintly. I sat on the porch steps, listening to the distant hum of life from other houses. Laughter. A barking dog. A door closing. Ordinary sounds. And then, the screen door creaked open behind me. He stepped out, hands in his pockets, and sat beside me. We didn't speak for a long time. The quiet between us wasn't hostile. It was thoughtful. Waiting. "I missed this," he said eventually. "Sitting here. Just being home." I nodded, unsure if I believed it or simply wanted to. "I know I've been distant," he added. "Lately. Maybe more than lately." I looked at him then. His face was calm, but not empty. I could see the effort in his expression, the subtle tension behind his eyes. "I thought I was doing everything right," he continued. "Working. Providing. Keeping things moving. But sometimes I wonder if I forgot to bring myself home too." I didn't interrupt. I let him speak. I needed to hear it just as much as he needed to say it. "I kept thinking I'd find the right moment to slow down," he said. "But I never did. And maybe that's on me." My throat felt tight. I looked out at the garden, the way the path curved out of sight behind the shrubs. "There's a lot I haven't said," I admitted quietly. "Things I should have. Things I didn't know how to." He turned to me slightly. I'm listening. But I couldn't tell him. Not yet. Maybe not ever. I wasn't ready to drop that weight into the space between us. Not when it might crush whatever remained. Instead, I said, I've been lonely. It was the closest I could get. He didn't respond right away. Then, slowly, he reached for my hand. Just a touch, nothing more. It felt foreign. Familiar. Strange. I don't want to lose you, he said. I closed my eyes. The wind shifted. The candles flickered. Somewhere down the street, a car engine started. Life continued, indifferent to the storms we weathered in private. Later, after he went inside, I remained on the porch. I sat in the silence, my fingers curled around the edge of my sleeve, thinking about the kiss, about the path in the garden, about the sound of footsteps on gravel. I thought about the version of myself that existed before any of this began. And the one sitting here now, holding a truth too heavy to say and too dangerous to ignore. The night deepened around me. I didn't move. Because sometimes, the hardest part of coming home is knowing whether you ever truly left. The morning air was cool and sharp, carrying with it a quiet promise of change. I moved through the house with a careful rhythm, each step measured, each breath steady. The days since his return had been a fragile truce between us, a tentative dance around the truths that lay heavy beneath our words. I sensed that neither of us knew how to break the surface without risking everything we had left. I spent the early hours in the kitchen, brewing coffee and wiping down counters with slow precision. The familiar sounds, the hum of the coffee maker, the clink of the mug, grounded me, tethered me to the world outside the turmoil in my mind. I looked out the window at the garden, the stone path glistening with dew, the roses still vivid despite the recent rains. They seemed resilient, stubborn in their beauty, and for a moment, I envied them. He was already awake when I went upstairs to dress. The bedroom door was open, and the soft glow of the lamp spilled into the hallway. He sat at the edge of the bed, staring at his hands folded in his lap. There was a weariness in his posture, a quiet surrender to whatever storm we were both weathering. We exchanged a few words over breakfast. Practical things. Plans for the day. The kind of conversation that fills the spaces when silence becomes unbearable but meaningful dialogue feels impossible. Neither of us mentioned the nights spent awake, the secrets we both carried. Later, I found myself drawn to the garden again. I needed the space, the clarity that came with tending to something living and growing. The man who had worked there before was nowhere in sight. I wandered along the stone path, my fingers brushing the edges of petals, tracing the curve of leaves. The quiet settled around me like a balm, though inside, a storm brewed. The house seemed to hold its breath. That afternoon, I heard the unmistakable sound of the gate. He was back. He carried a bundle of branches, freshly cut, the scent of pine sharp and clean. He laid them carefully near the shed and began arranging them with a meticulous eye. His focus was absolute, and I watched him from the porch, feeling the familiar ache in my chest. He didn't speak until he looked up, meeting my gaze with something close to vulnerability. "I thought maybe you'd want help with the new flower beds," he said. I nodded, surprised by the offer, and set down the book I'd been reading. We spent the next few hours side by side, planting bulbs and clearing weeds. The sun moved slowly across the sky, shadows lengthening and shifting with time. At one point, I caught him watching me, the way his eyes softened when I laughed at something small and silly. The moment passed before either of us could name it, but it left a trace, an unspoken acknowledgement of something real, something fragile. When the work was done, we sat on the porch steps, sweat drying on our skin, breaths slowing. He turned to me and said quietly, "You look tired." I smiled faintly. "I think I've been carrying too much." He nodded in understanding, and for a brief moment, the distance between us seemed to shrink. That evening, the house felt fuller. Not with noise or grand gestures, but with presence. My husband stayed longer than usual, sitting with me in the living room, sharing memories from trips we'd taken years ago. It was awkward at times, the words stumbling over old silences, but it was honest. I realized that neither of us had forgotten how to talk, just how to listen. Later, as I prepared for bed, I found a note slipped under my door. His handwriting, careful and deliberate, "Thank you for today. I want to try." I folded the paper carefully and placed it on my nightstand. Sleep came slowly, filled with restless thoughts and quiet hopes. In the morning, I awoke to the sound of rain again. A steady drizzle that softened the edges of the world outside. I dressed quickly and stepped into the garden, letting the cool drops fall on my skin. The path was slippery, but the roses stood tall, vibrant against the gray sky. I thought about the days ahead, the uncertain future, the choices waiting to be made. And though fear lingered, there was a small, stubborn flame of hope flickering within me. Maybe, just maybe, we could find our way back. The days that followed were a quiet negotiation between what was said and what was left unsaid. The house held a tentative calm, but beneath the surface, I could feel the tension stretching taut like a fragile thread. I moved through my routines with careful attention, as if walking on a floor that might crack under the slightest misstep. Each morning, I rose early, drawn to the garden before the sun had fully claimed the sky. The dew settled on the leaves, the air was cool and sharp, and the world seemed to hold its breath in those first moments of the day. I found solace in the rituals of planting and pruning, grounding myself in the tangible work of nurturing life. He was often there, too. Not every day, but enough that the rhythm of our shared silence became a language of its own. We exchanged few words, but the presence between us grew heavier, filled with memories and possibilities tangled like the vines we trimmed. One afternoon, while trimming the overgrowth near the fence, I stumbled on a rusted hinge and twisted my ankle slightly. He was at my side immediately, steadying me without hesitation. His hands were sure and calm as he helped me to sit on a nearby bench. For a moment, the world narrowed to the space between us, the warmth of his touch against the coolness of the air. I caught his gaze, searching for something I couldn't name. He looked away first, as if aware of the weight of the moment. That night, I lay awake long after the house had fallen silent. The events of the day replayed in my mind, mingling with fears and hopes I struggled to untangle. I wondered if we were both waiting for a sign, a signal that the path ahead was clear, or at least passable. The phone rang just as I was about to surrender to sleep. It was him. His voice was low and steady. "I'm sorry about earlier. I didn't mean to startle you." I smiled despite myself. "It's all right." We talked briefly about mundane things, the weather, the progress on the garden, a neighbor's dog. The conversation was careful, cautious, but it cracked open a door I thought was sealed. After we hung up, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in weeks. Connection. The next day, I found a small envelope on the kitchen table. Inside was a pressed flower, delicate and vibrant, with a note simply reading, "For the garden." I touched the petals gently, feeling the tenderness behind the gesture. Later, my husband returned home from work earlier than expected. The house seemed to hold its breath as he stepped inside. His presence was familiar but different, as if the weight of absence had carved new lines into his face. We exchanged greetings with a cautious warmth, neither rushing into the silence that hung between us. Dinner was quiet but shared, the clinking of cutlery punctuating the spaces where conversation might have been. Afterward, he sat in the living room, flipping through a photo album we hadn't looked at in years. I watched from the doorway, seeing glimpses of laughter and life captured in the faded images. When he looked up and caught my gaze, there was a softness there, a silent acknowledgement of the distance we'd traveled and the hope for a way back. That night, I felt the house settle around us, the tension easing slightly like a tide retreating but never fully gone. I knew the road ahead would be difficult, fraught with unspoken questions and fragile truths. But for the first time in a long while, I dared to believe that healing might be possible. And as I drifted to sleep, the garden outside whispered promises of growth, resilience, and the quiet strength found in tending to what matters most. The morning sun filtered through the curtains with a golden softness, casting long shadows across the floor. I lay still, listening to the quiet breathing beside me. My husband had fallen asleep early the night before, his body finally surrendering to the exhaustion that had been building for weeks. There was something comforting about his presence, and yet, it pressed against me like a weight I couldn't quite shift. I rose quietly, careful not to disturb him, and padded down the hallway in bare feet. The house was cool, the wooden floors smooth beneath my soles. I stood by the kitchen window with a cup of tea, watching the light stretch across the garden. The roses were blooming fully now, heavy with color, their petals slowly unfolding in the warmth. The stone path curved gently through them like a quiet reminder of where everything had started. I stepped outside, the air fresh and clean. Dew clung to the grass, and birds fluttered from branch to branch in the distance. I walked along the garden's edge, stopping at the bench near the trellis. The breeze carried the scent of pine and soil, and for a moment, I allowed myself to close my eyes and simply breathe. The sound of the gate opening pulled me gently back to the present. He entered without speaking, his steps slow and deliberate. He carried a small box in his hands, the corners worn and edges taped neatly. When he reached the porch, he hesitated before placing it carefully on the table. I didn't ask what was inside. He looked at me then, his expression unreadable. There was something final in the way he stood, something settled. "I wanted to leave this with you," he said, his voice low but steady. "Just some tools, things I won't need where I'm going." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak yet. He glanced toward the garden, his gaze sweeping over the flowers, the path, the shaded corners he had helped bring to life. "It's yours now," he added. "All of it." There was a pause between us, wide and deep, filled with things neither of us could fully name. "I'm leaving at the end of the week," he continued. "New place, different kind of work. Thought it might help to start over." The words landed with a strange clarity, like a stone dropped into still water. Not dramatic. Just real. "I understand," I said quietly. He nodded, his shoulders easing slightly, as if some invisible burden had shifted. We stood in silence for a while. The wind stirred the chimes, their sound delicate and distant. The garden felt alive, almost listening. "I don't regret knowing you," he said. The words were simple, but they reached into something deep. I looked at him then, really looked, at the lines around his eyes, the quiet strength in his jaw, the care he had offered without asking for anything in return. "I don't regret it either," I replied. He gave a faint smile, the kind that doesn't reach the eyes but means something anyway. Then he turned, walked back to the gate, and left without looking back. I stood there until the wind shifted. Inside the box, I later found gloves, pruning shears, a folded note, and a small jar of soil, dark, rich, from the garden bed we'd worked on together. The note was brief. "Some things grow even in silence." I folded the paper and placed it in the drawer beside the others. The gloves I hung by the door. That afternoon, my husband returned from the store with 2 paper bags and a hopeful expression. He kissed my cheek, light and tentative, and unpacked groceries as if nothing had changed. I watched him for a long moment, noting the effort in his movements, the nervous way he looked over his shoulder every few minutes. He was trying. That much was clear. We ate dinner on the porch, the candles flickering softly between us. The food was warm, the conversation gentle, mostly about the small things, neighbors, work, the weather. But it was enough to keep the silence at bay. Later, after he had gone upstairs, I wandered back to the garden. The stars were beginning to appear, one by one, in the deepening sky. The bench near the trellis still held the warmth of the day, and I sat there, wrapping a shawl around my shoulders. I looked at the path he'd made. The curves he had chosen. The spaces between each stone. I imagined him walking there now, in some other place, starting over. I didn't cry. I didn't need to. Instead, I traced the path with my eyes until it disappeared behind the lavender bushes. Then I sat in stillness, listening to the quiet beat of my own heart, letting the wind carry the rest away. The final morning arrived with an odd kind of stillness. Not the gentle calm of peace, but a dense, heavy quiet that pressed into the corners of the house like fog. The sun took its time rising, casting pale gold across the floors and walls as if unsure of its welcome. I stood at the sink, hands wrapped around a mug I wasn't drinking from, staring through the window at the garden that had become a witness to everything I could no longer hide. He was gone. Not just from the garden or the path or the town, but from the space he'd once filled in my days like sunlight, quietly, gradually, then all at once. He had left with intention, not drama. He had left kindly, which somehow hurt more. The box of tools remained by the door. I hadn't moved it. Every time I passed by it, I felt a subtle throb of guilt and something like gratitude. It was strange to think how quickly someone could pass through your life and still leave behind echoes. Footprints. Changes so small they only became visible in silence. My husband sat at the table, reading the newspaper like it was any other morning. He looked up and smiled when I walked into the room. The smile was tired, not worn from resentment, but from trying. We had both been trying, in our own ways. And I think we both knew that effort didn't always erase what had already happened. But it was something. He asked if I wanted to take a walk later. I said yes, because the alternative was another long afternoon of pretending there wasn't a distance neither of us could name. We walked in the early afternoon, circling the block slowly. The air was thick with the smell of summer settling in, cut grass, warmed pavement, and neighbor's barbecue. His hand brushed mine a few times, and I let it stay. We didn't talk much. Just enough to be polite. Just enough to feel like we weren't strangers. Back at the house, he went upstairs to make some calls. I wandered to the garden, barefoot, letting the earth press into the soles of my feet. The bench by the trellis was warm again, and I sat there for a long time, tracing the lines of the path with my eyes. Everything felt both too close and far away. I remembered the first day we moved in, the way I stood in this exact place, staring at the neglected garden, wondering what would bloom. I had imagined roses, tall grasses, lavender maybe. I hadn't imagined confusion. Or guilt. Or the quiet ache of having betrayed something before I could name what it was I needed. I didn't hate myself for what I had done. But I didn't excuse it either. It had happened because I had been empty. Because I had let something inside me go quiet for too long. Because someone noticed the silence and chose not to ignore it. That was the truth, no matter how I tried to shape it into something easier. And now he was gone. The next few days passed with a strange rhythm. My husband and I began to talk more. Not deeply, not about what had broken, but about the things we could agree on, the yard, our routines, old memories. It wasn't healing exactly. But it was movement. One evening, as we sat on the porch, he turned to me and asked, "Are you happy here?" The question landed softly, but it held weight. I didn't answer right away. I watched a moth dance near the porch light, watched the way its wings caught the glow and flickered like tiny signals. "I don't know," I said finally. "But I want to be." He nodded once, and I could see that he understood that was the most I could give. Later, alone in the bedroom, I opened the drawer where I had kept all the small notes. His, mine, the one with the flower, the one with the soil. I took them out one by one, unfolding them slowly, reading the words until they blurred. Then I placed them in a small wooden box and tucked it in the back of the closet, not to hide them, but to let them rest. Some things don't need to be forgotten. They just need to be set down. I went back outside, walking the length of the garden one last time before nightfall. The roses were beginning to close. The path was familiar under my steps. I stopped by the edge of the fence and looked up at the sky, where the stars had just begun to appear. And I breathed. Not for closure. Not for forgiveness. But because I could. The wind stirred gently, lifting the hem of my shirt and brushing the back of my neck. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I had already carried everything forward.